Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today I have a very special guest. Brittany from Books with Brittany is joining me in a discussion today. Hello, Brittany.
Hello, thank you for having me.
It is fantastic to have you on the channel. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this. And I know working out timing with a busy booktuber such as yourself. Thank you for fitting me into your schedule. I really do appreciate it.
Yes, of course. I'm excited.
And today, what we'd planned to talk about, and it turns out this is a slightly more hot topic than I'd intended, was different approaches to reading, different approaches to consuming narrative, and different approaches to reviewing, and what it is that we do when we review or when we talk about books. And that's kind of the general topic. And I know in the last week or so, apparently this has blown up into a much hotter topic than you and I had originally intended this discussion to be. Um, so one of the things that I've noted about your book reviews, and when you talk about books, you're usually very clear to say, what books that you have physically read and what books that you listen to as an audio, and sometimes that you say, oh, I did both, or I was moving between them. And I uh, I have been misquoted as saying that I hate audiobooks. I don't enjoy them. I prefer physically reading. So I thought we'd have a bit of a chat about is there a difference in the experience, and what is that difference? Because I believe there is a difference. Not that one is better than the other, but that the experiences are slightly different, and those differences should be understood. So
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's kind of hard because as somebody who is able to like physically read a book and have that opportunity, like I don't want to take away from somebody that doesn't have that and can only listen to a book, I guess. But for myself personally, I'm not an auditory learner. So I really had a hard time getting into audiobooks. Like I would listen and then rewind and be like, I have to start over. I have no idea what happened. So I have years and years of practice at this point, so I've gotten a lot better. But still, if I'm starting out a series like The Wheel of Time or Malazan, things where I'm learning a magic system or there are different terms, places, I have to read it with my eyes because my brain will not hold on to that information if they are words, names of people, places, things that my brain's not familiar with. I have to read it with my eyes in order to like grasp that. But there's certain genres that I read that really almost work better for me in an audiobook format, as well as I'm not somebody who has a really easy time picturing what's going on when I'm reading. Like I just don't get that mental picture as easy as some people do, I think. And when I am listening to a book versus reading it physically, I can see it better because it's like somebody is describing a picture to me. Whereas when I'm reading it physically, my eyes like almost just skim past, like I'm not skim reading it, but my brain doesn't pick up on it as well, if that sort of makes sense.
yeah, because one of the things that I find, and it's interesting you mentioned that genres sometimes can play a factor in this, because I remember there was a job I was doing one time where my hands had to be busy. It was a mind-numbing, repetitive manual job. So my hands were busy, and my brain was bouncing around in my head, going, I need something to entertain me. And audiobooks were absolutely perfect for that. And I tried a couple of different ones. And what I found was if the narrative was written either more in a tell style or was a narrative that was heavily plot focused, so it was all about the narrative events and a surface level of information, that I found those to be brilliant audiobooks to listen to while I was working, because I could listen to that and it was telling me a story and it worked really well. But what I found was when I tried to listen to a more complex literary work that was about a lot of the subtext going on and a lot of poetic devices worked into the actual prose, that was far more difficult for me to decode as I was listening to it. Whereas that was a kind of book that I would read physically, and that's part of my process of reading physically. So I found that the style of narration played a big part in whether or not I was enjoying it and following along. And it made me sort of come to this position that I think with a lot of audiobooks, the style of prose can actually play a huge part in how we process it. More, perhaps more so than whether or not we think of ourselves as visual or auditory learners. I mean, all of the recent pedagogical studies have shown that, you know, we aren't any one type of learner. It's when we combine visual and auditory and kinesthetic and verbal, when we combine all of them in different ways, we get a more complete picture. So you're limiting yourself to just one. And when you think about it, you go, yeah, if I look at a diagram, I'm visually processing a diagram, but I'm also reading part of it. And then the teacher or lecturer is explaining something. And then I read the notes about it. And then I try to draw it myself. And the combination of all of those things is what gives us our understanding. But I think with any skill, and listening to audiobooks or reading a text, those are both skills that require practice. And the more practiced you get at it, the better you get at it. So did you find that which genres then did you find seem to work better as audiobooks?
I started listening. I don't really like thrillers anymore, but I love horror. So I started listening to thrillers through audiobook format and then transitioned to horror. And that works really well because generally it's grounded in our world. It's things that we're familiar with. I'm not really having to learn like any new concepts or places I've never heard of. So I do love horror as well as most nonfiction. If it's something that has a ton of like statistics and facts, like then I find that I need to visually see that as well. But like biographies or memoirs, things like that, I like through audiobook. And then a lot of sci-fi I love the audio versions of as well. And I don't know if it, because once again, a lot of the terminology I'm more familiar with, especially if it's a sci-fi kind of like based on Earth or with the past history. Fantasy is the hardest for me. There are, I almost never choose to listen to an audiobook for a fantasy book first, like almost never.
Yeah, a good friend of mine loves audiobooks because obviously when he's commuting, he puts the audiobook on and he has quite a long commute and he goes, it's absolutely fantastic. You know, whereas it would be, you know, slightly irresponsible and a wee bit dangerous to have that giant hardback fantasy novel balanced on your steering wheel. So, you know, there's a wonderful accessibility to audiobooks that the written word has a much higher bar because I think we, even developmentally, we understand hearing language a lot earlier than when we practice reading. And I think quite often our reading lags behind our auditory comprehension of language. And that I think is a fascinating thing. So not only someone who cannot physically read, but someone whose literary skills or literacy level is not as advanced, say, as the text, but they will have perfect comprehension when it comes to the audio version of the text. And that is, I think, increasingly important because literacy levels in the UK, in the US, are actually quite surprisingly low in terms of the reading age that the average person has. And audiobooks are a great leveler for that literacy now is not the driving force for being able to access a lot of these texts. So audiobooks have this wonderful ability to increase the size of the audience.
It's hard almost for me to wrap my brain around that, somebody who has a harder time with audiobooks. But I have friends that, you know, they'll pick up a dense fantasy book and try to read it, the hardcover copy, and can't pay attention, they zone out, it's just not sinking in, it's not making sense. And then they listen to the audiobook and they're like, it's great. Whereas for someone like me being the exact opposite, it's harder to imagine. I'm like, I wish I had that ability.
Well, I mean, I absolutely suck at multitasking, which is why reading a book is perfect for me because it's one thing that I have to do. But you see, trying to listen to something while chopping chopping up vegetables for dinner, if I start paying attention to the audio experience, I'm likely to lose a finger. And when I'm paying attention to the chopping, I miss chunks of the audio. So this is why I need something that my hands aren't in danger while I'm listening to an audiobook. But it's fantastic because you can multitask, you can do other things. And that level of accessibility, that allowing us that experience, I think is a fantastic strength of audiobooks.
it,
And
it allows us to even just read more. Like I listen to an audiobook every day that I'm working out. Like I have it down to the point where I can count my reps and my sets and everything, keep track of it all while I'm listening to an audiobook. And maybe that's because
hang
I'm
on a
not.
sec. Talk about humble bragging. Oh yeah, I'm listening to all it while I'm working out and I'm doing my reps. And
Well, I listen very slowly most of the time. I can't like speed my audiobooks up really fast like some people do. But I also can't listen to super complicated things. And that's probably why, because I'm multitasking.
um, but I think one of the big differences that personally I believe that there is between an audiobook and reading a book is when you listen to an audiobook, there's an interlocutor. There's a person standing between you and the text, and that's the audiobook narrator. And that audiobook narrator can, for some readers, elevate the text because they give this amazing performance. But even with that, even when they give an amazing performance, that is fixing the text in one particular interpretation. And the way that I've tried to illustrate this in the past is if you think of a Shakespearean play, and you can read Hamlet, you can sit down and you can read all of the dialogue, and in your head you can assign people different accents. You can imagine the whole thing, and when you read it at a later stage, you have different accents that you give people. You're in a different position, so you emphasize different things, and the book remains static. The text remains exactly the same. Hamlet, the text is not changing, but the narrative that you create in your head can change dramatically depending on the mood that you're in, the time of day it is, your life experiences, whether or not you're now in a different culture and have been living there for a while. It's caused you to reinterpret things. All of these things can filter into a reinterpretation of the text. And that means the narrative keeps evolving, even though the text is fixed. But when you have an audiobook, the text is fixed and your interpretation is fixed because it's the audiobook narrator's interpretation that you're hearing. So instead of reading Hamlet, if you think of all of the different versions of Hamlet that you can watch with all of the different actors, imagine there was only ever one actor and that was the one performance of Hamlet. But when you think of all of those other performances of Hamlet, they emphasize different things. They created different feelings and different emotions. So when you have an audiobook narrator, to me, that fixes the narrative in a very particular lens. But when you read the text, the narrative will always shift because it's in your imagination. You are your own narrator. So I think that's a difference. Not necessarily a detriment, but it's a difference.
And it can be a detriment at times though, because there's definitely some audiobooks that I like with services where you can play a sample, because some I just can't listen to, and I have some sensory issues where like certain pitches I just can't listen to. So there are certain narrators that, like, I'm not trying to be insulting, but I just can't listen to, or it changes the tone completely of the book, just even based on the voice, I think, that is being used. And like you said, then that's just permanently, I imagine that'd be frustrating as an author, actually, if you weren't in love with the performance. But as you said, there are certain audiobooks that have tremendously enhanced my experience. of reading the book, I suppose.
Yeah, and that's the thing. It's you can never predict what narrators are going to work for the listener, because some listeners will go, "Oh, I will listen no matter who wrote the book. I will listen to anything that they've performed because I just love the sound of their voice. I love what they do, and it helps me enjoy a book." And other people go, "How can you like them? They're terrible. Oh, their voice goes right through me." But this is the same thing about preferences that we have with the types of books that we like, where you go, oh, I really love this style of prose, I love this type of narrative, I love these styles of characters, and other people can go, how can you like that? Oh, that I would rather gouge out my eyes than read that. There's no accounting for taste. But when we think about, and obviously I've talked a lot about different narrative techniques, and first person narrative to my mind is one of those ones that really suits the audiobook treatment, because it's in the eye, it's someone telling you a story, and it falls into that natural mode of you as a listener listening to someone tell you a story about their life, and that first person narration seems almost perfectly made for audiobooks.
Yeah, I agree with that. And then I guess my other favorite like form, I don't know if it would just be like full cast, because then it's really easy to follow and you don't miss, the author saying, okay, now this person's talking. You're just able to pick up on it by listening to voice alone. Or the I forget what they're called, like the deluxe audiobooks that have like all of the sound effects in them,
like a
graphic
radio play.
I think Sanderson has some like called graphic audio that just like enhance, or I know all the Star Wars books are that way as well. So you feel like it's a full production, and that adds a lot to the whole experience.
But and that's bringing like an audiobook more almost into a radio play, into a teleplay almost, and all you're missing is the visual.
Yeah.
Whereas, and that if you think about that as an experience, that's radically different from what an author intended for how their book to be read, but also B, the vast majority of people when they are reading a book, that experience with sound effects and different actors, and it could be an amazing performance, but that's a performance of the text, not the text itself.
That's true.
So again, it comes down to that. It's one interpretation of a text, and I think again, I always have to be so careful and so explicit about this. I'm not saying audiobooks are bad, because people keep saying that I hate audiobooks. It's like I don't.
I don't think you're saying audiobooks are bad at all. I know a lot of people. I mean, I talk to people every single day that I just can't get into audiobooks. I don't like audiobooks. So you're definitely not alone in not preferring them.
Yeah, but also saying that I don't enjoy them as much as reading is a bit like saying, well, I don't enjoy fish as much as I enjoy broccoli. It's expressing a simple question of taste and preference about something, rather than definitively saying, oh no, audiobooks are bad. They aren't proper reading. And you go, it's still the text. It's a way of approaching the text. But for me, and particularly for when I'm doing analysis, at least the first couple of times that I'm looking at text, I physically have to look at it. I have to go backwards and forwards over the written word. If I am trying to remind myself about something, then speeding through an audiobook while I'm doing something else, to go, there's the bit that I wanted, and making a quick note. I use a lot of the audio stuff that way. When I'm doing editing, or when I'm writing research papers. But for enjoyment's sake, I have to go with reading, because if I'm listening to an audiobook and I'm not doing anything else, and I sit back and I relax, the next thing you know, I'm like,
Yeah.
and I've dozed off, and then I wake up and go, I have no idea what chapter I was on. There's not even a bookmark.
Well, I have to say too that if I have a feeling that a book is going to be like a favorite book, or it's something I'm extremely excited about, um, I won't listen to the audiobook of it first. I'll listen to it on my second time reading it, um, because audiobooks almost never make it to my favorite books. So for me, I know that the way that I interpret the story, it is better through reading the written word on the page. I know that for myself, that audiobooks almost never end up being favorite books. And I don't know if that's just the ones I'm choosing, or if it's I like seeing the words on the page. So I don't know if it's just coincidence, but I doubt it. I mean, I've been listening and reading for a long time. So I guess
Well,
that's the same thing.
and I think for me, the physically reading is a very active experience for me. That my brain is actively engaged. I'm looking, I'm focusing, I'm doing all of these, I'm thinking as it's going through. But I fall into the trap of audiobooks and listening being a very passive experience. And that's what I find is the difficulty I have. Reading for me is very, very active and focused, but listening becomes very passive. And that's where I have my difficulty with that. So something that is a great story being told to you, or something that is very, or even actually World War Z by Max Brooks is a brilliant example of a text that is written to replicate dialogue, to replicate people speaking, people telling stories. And so as an audiobook, it is absolutely pitch perfect because it replicates that experience so well, because that's what he was trying to copy for the text. So the audiobook is actually truer to the diegetic reality created than the text would have been. And so, I mean, it was a brilliant audiobook and I really, really enjoyed it. And then some of the science fiction adventures that I listened to, particularly a lot of the older science fiction, that was heavily into the narrative events and things happening and things being described to you. Those I thought worked brilliantly as audiobooks. But as soon as I started trying to, when I was writing research papers on particularly complex texts, trying to listen to those ones just didn't work for me because it was a much more passive experience and I was tuning out. But that's my problem with it.
No, I agree. And even when you were saying, just expanding upon the active and passive part a little bit, like I will get stuck on a word, and I have a math, science, biology degree and brain, not language writing at all. So my vocabulary is probably not as great as somebody who does this for a living. But so I will look up words. Like I can't let it go. If I don't know what a word is, I look it up. If I'm listening, no, it just, you know what I mean? It keeps going. It flows that way. But it's funny you mentioned that about World War Z, because I always talk, I'm like, don't read it, listen to the audiobook, because you get the perspectives from all around the world and the different accents. And
Yeah.
um, the same thing with like, I love Foundation by Isaac Asimov, the trilogy, but I tell people, I'm like, listen to it. You're going to have a better chance of liking it than physically reading it. I think for a lot of people.
And again, I think some of the older science fiction works, because they are written in a more direct narrative style, where you are being told a story in them. I think that style of narration translates very well to audiobook. They seem naturally made, because if you think the evolution of humankind, we have been telling each other stories for tens of thousands of years. We have only been writing stories for a relatively short space of time. So the natural mode of storytelling is to tell a story. And it's how we tell stories about the dumb things our friends did last night in the bar. It's how we tell stories about the dumb things that we did last night in the bar. There's your third person, first person narration. And it's so natural, we fall into that. So third person past tense and first person past tense are two of the most natural forms of storytelling. And you can understand exactly why a lot of audiobooks work so well, because they replicate that. It speaks to who we are and how we've evolved.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense about the storytelling. I didn't actually even think of it from that perspective, but that's interesting.
I probably spend far too much time thinking about random things like this, and you spend your time with your maths and science and useful things that you can do with your brain, with a useful degree.
They're all useful.
Oh, I think my family would differ. Um, but when when we approach the tricky topic of talking about reviewing books and how we talk about books, and this is I think has become a delicate topic recently. When to me it's never been a particularly hot topic or even controversy ridden topic. But when we talk about reviewing books, how is it that you approach it? Because obviously I can talk about what I do, but how do you approach reviewing? Like, how do you go about it? How do you think about a book that you're going to review?
I'm pretty open on my channel about the fact that my ratings and reviewing comes from mainly my enjoyment level and emotional impact, I suppose. I don't feel qualified to break down a novel on like it's literary factors. That's just out of my wheelhouse. That is not something I'm comfortable with. I don't feel qualified to break apart a book that way. Um, so for me, it's more of a relatability factor. And I think that people are able to determine if they will like a book based on the way that I talk about it. Because like you said, I really try to say, even if I'm not afraid to put books down and DNF them, did not finish them if I don't like it. So I don't read a ton of books that I end up not loving, but I try to say, these are the things I didn't like, and this is why, and these are the things I love, because that's what I want people to take away from my channel. I find it I love seeing excitement from other reviewers. And I love seeing somebody gush and say, I love this, I love this. And then they move on to the next book review. And I'm like, well, why? Like, why did you like it? What was the good thing about it? Because I want to know. I mean, I read almost all my books through the library before I buy them. But like, I want to know if I'm going to choose to either purchase this book or spend the time reading it, if I'm going to like it. Like, I want some little idea. So I definitely base my ratings and reviews on enjoyment and emotional impact. I would say those are the two main things.
But and this was something, but before we started recording, it was something I had said about the reviews on your channel that I really enjoy is if you say, oh, I really like this thing, the thing that immediately follows that is because, and then you explain the why part. And the reason I value that so much in reviews is your preferences are your preferences. My preferences are my preferences. They are entirely personal. And I don't know enough about you, which is probably a good thing that you don't have some sort of weird stalker. But I don't know enough about your preferences to know whether or not your taste and my taste align. I can do that with my friends. When my friends and we've been friends for decades, we can say, oh, you're going to hate that book. Don't bother reading it because it does those things. Because they know me and they know my tastes. But I don't particularly know yours. I don't know any reviewer's taste that well. And so when a reviewer says, I didn't like the characterization, I thought the characterization was bad, you go, so they're stating a preference. They're stating their opinion. If they then move on, I don't know whether or not the style of characterization used in that novel is something I'm going to like. But if they explain why they thought it was bad, if they go into why they thought the characterization was bad or why it didn't work for them, then I can go, oh, but I like that style of characterization. So regardless of whether or not it is a positive or negative review, regardless of whether or not the reviewer liked it or disliked it, if they give me that information about the actual thing, then the review is actually useful to me. But if it's based solely in what they liked and didn't like, then that review is not a review that is going to be useful to me. And it's not a reviewer I would ever return to watching their reviews anymore. Because, I want to find out about the book. I don't necessarily want to find out about how you felt about it. Right. And I think that's a personal choice about the style of review that I enjoy. because there are so many different ways of reviewing and different types of reviews with different intentions.
I think from what I tend to enjoy, and so what I try to do on my channel is I like the combination. So I like watching reviews or videos where the reviewer is able to say what they liked and what they didn't like and why. But like overall, I want to know how you like the book, which is why I like star ratings, because that is sort of like a star rating has no value without an explanation to some degree. I mean, I won't say no, but in my opinion, you need the two together. But I feel like if you give a star rating, it's like your overall didn't love this book or I love this book. And then I look for the explanation because I think in like booktube and with a lot of booktubers, the following and even for me the channels that I love, it's like I want to get to know their taste. Like I want to know what things they love and didn't know. It's like the more personable factor, I suppose, when you bring the personal enjoyment into it. So I kind of like the combination of the two.
And yeah, I mean it's for that, because I talked a bit about in a different video about reader response theory and how that actually informs a different way of approaching, say, reviewing, or a different way of thinking about text and analyzing text, because we have our own personal feelings about a book. And it is no secret anymore that I am not a fan of Harry Potter. My wife, on the other hand, loves Harry Potter. But I'm not a fan of Harry Potter. So if I was to review Harry Potter, how would I approach it? Because obviously I didn't like it. So would I give it a negative review? And because of how I used to do reviews when I was getting reviews published and that sort of thing, it all depended on the audience. Because if you were going to give a book review and you were to deliver it to the Queen, she's asked for a private audience, and she's asked, I've heard that you've read this book and I would like your opinion on it. Can you come to Buckingham Palace and give me a review? So think about the Queen as your audience. Then think about, well, actually, it's 5 of your buddies. And they've said, listen, we're meeting up down in that coffee shop. We're all thinking about this book. We know that you've read it. Come and give us your review. And then think about, you've been invited into a high school because they're about to launch on a reading project about the book, and you've been invited in to give them your review. Now, do you think in those 3 circumstances you'd give exactly the same review to the person?
No, I think it's hard.
But you would hold to the truth of your review. You wouldn't lie to people. You wouldn't say it is a good book, where like, this is a fantastic book and it does everything brilliantly. You wouldn't say that if you didn't believe it. But how you communicate is going to change according to your audience. Mm-hmm. Because with the kids, you might want to emphasize there's actually some really exciting stuff in this, and it's really interesting, and you're going to see these things. You might want to focus on that as a high priority for that audience in that milieu of an educational setting. Your friends, on the other hand, and also the tone and style of your language is going to be more suitable for a classroom. Whereas when you're talking to your friends, your language might be slightly more relaxed, and you might be a lot more heartfelt in expressing the negative aspects and not so careful in how you phrase things. Mm-hmm. But if you were speaking to the Queen, your language would be exceptionally polite, but you would still give an honest and to the best of your ability, accurate review of a text. So I think it's really interesting that the style of review, your imagined audience, and what you want that review to do or to communicate actually changes. And it's not that there's just one type of reviewing and one type of review and one type of audience. I think that's a really fascinating thing.
I don't think I've ever sat down and thought about it like you just stated in that way. And now I'm just kind of like, how would it change? I think I'm somebody that tries to be brutally honest as far as being truthful. Like I just reviewed a book that everyone is giving 5 stars, and I was like, this is barely a 2-star book for me, but here's why. But I think when I approach reviewing for my channel, I really just think of my audience as a group of friends, like sitting down with my friends. Hey guys, this is what I liked. This is what I didn't like. Because it seems more casual. It can be more relatable, I
Mhm.
suppose, for this particular situation. But yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, here's a challenge. Next time that you're reviewing a book, do your normal review and then try a 5-minute segment as if you were giving the review to the Queen of England.
I didn't want you to say the Queen. I knew
Just
you were going to say the Queen.
no, you don't have to do an impersonation of her, but like at the end of the review, go, okay, this is an experiment. How would my review change if I was imagining that all of you were the Queen of England? Just to see if it's a wee bit different.
I'll give it a
I'm
go.
convinced. I'm convinced it is.
Yeah, I'm convinced it would be too, but I got to put some thought into that one.
Because this is a bizarre thing, and it's the type of language that we use. Now, obviously, I uh, I have a reputation for using overly academic language, and I'm not doing it on purpose. I never deliberately use complicated or esoteric or arcane academic terms to try to make myself sound smarter or more important. The problem is it got beaten into me through the course of doing all of this. And it's the automatic word that your brain reaches for when you're talking. And obviously, I do a lot of just talking straight to the camera because I find video editing very complicated. So it's just easier for me to talk directly to camera. So I have a reputation for using quite academic terminology. One of the things about academic terminology is it tends to be very neutral, neither positive nor negative. It's much more descriptive. But what I find is when I am discussing things with friends, I tend to use much more personal, informal, and quite often evaluative language. So instead of, to give an example of this, instead of describing narrative pacing slowing for an exploration of a secondary plot thread, which I might say, in all honesty, quite naturally. It sounds weird, but that's kind of how I talk, and I can't help it. But I would imagine other people go, see that middle bit of a slog, because there's this whole side quest that he focuses on. And you can see we're both talking about the same thing, but one is non-pejorative. It's not saying it is good or bad. It's describing the actual thing and letting you know that this happens. The other is describing it in negative terms, because slog, even if you don't intend it to be a negative, slog is a negative. It is a pejorative. Side quest is making a judgment about this is not the main narrative, it is secondary, and it is not concerned with, and it is a digression that should not be included. And you can see how, even if that's not the intention, it can lead to that sort of subconscious thought. So what do you think about that, saying as you're going to be reviewing a book for the Queen of England?
I need a teacher. I am very envious of people like yourself who just naturally speak with that language, because it's not a skill that I have, and it's a skill I'm sure that I could learn with further education. And so that's why I do tend to gravitate, I think, towards authors who speak that way in their narrative style, or even booktubers who have that language, because I guess that is, I don't want to say something I'm envious of, but something I admire, I suppose. But I just know that it's not my forte. It's not my knowledge base. And so, yeah, I wish that I was able to give a more, I don't want to say neutral, but I can see what you're saying. Like, just by word choice alone, even if you're not intending to sway someone's opinion, when you're using those words, it already puts a thought in their mind of this is a negative.
Well, firstly, I wasn't born speaking this way. This was beaten into me as an undergraduate and through that all of that studying. It was beaten into me time and time again. It was writing all of those formal essays. It was doing all of that. This is not naturally sort of, oh, it just popped into AP's head. No, it was beaten into me by those mean lecturers who made me cry. But it is, if I can learn it, seriously, if I can learn it, anyone can learn it. It's just a question of becoming familiar with it. It's the same when you were studying your fields and what you focused on. The very first time someone was using a whole load of, let's say you were actually, because this isn't my field, I'm now going, AP, think of sciencey things. But talking about strange action at a distance and quantum mechanics, and they start then talking about brains and end brains and talking about quantum theory in that way, and then talking about different ways of dimensionality and blah blah, and they start using their academic terms. The very first time you hear that, you go, my brain is leaking out my ears, I don't know what's going on. But the more familiar you become with it, you're like, oh yeah, but they're just talking about that thing. It's just a word that means. It's how we learn all language. You start with context to know what its rough meaning is, and then we start to understand the specific meaning. So that's the first thing I would say is, if I can learn this stuff, anyone can learn this stuff. It's not a natural born gift. An obsession, maybe. Yeah, okay, well, we'll go with that. But I think your point is a good one, because there are certain terms that we use, I think, unthinkingly. We use the term unthinkingly because it's just the term that we use. And one of the examples that I gave, I was speaking to Mike on Mike's book reviews, and I said, there is a difference between info dump and exposition. Because info dump is a type of exposition, and it's usually when exposition has been done badly. But exposition is the general term for, descriptive passages. That's exposition. That is descriptive. It's not all info dumping. Info dumping is a specific type, and info dumping is a pejorative. And I think Mike kind of looked at me. I was like, oh, because it wasn't a distinction that anyone had said needed to be made. That everyone just uses the term info dump when they mean exposition. And yet one is pejorative and the other is describing a type of prose.
When somebody says info dumping, though, I'm like, okay, I'm gonna like it, because I like long descriptive passages. That is something I enjoy in books for the most part. So, but I know what you mean. Most people are like, oh, that's bad. That's a bad thing.
but info dumping, you've started reading a lot more classic science fiction now, haven't you?
Yeah, I've started to recently. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So those moments in science fiction where you have like the inventor character or the brilliant character, and then the sidekick comes in or some character and they go, well, Bob, and they then explain everything in excruciating detail. And it's one of those well, Bob moments where they have a sidekick and they explain everything so the reader can actually follow along. Mm-hmm. And you go, that's info dumping in dialogue. And you also have obviously sections where there's a long descriptive passage that outlines the history of everything, almost like it was one of those voiceovers in a movie, that you're watching the film and it goes, and in 1879 they rose to, and it gives you this whole synopsis of everything to give you the context, and it's just dropped in there. That's an info dump. But those passages, and you see it in like Robin Hobb, you see it in Stephen Erickson, you see it in like all of these authors where they work in brilliant detail. Lots of subtextual information, lots of detail about the world. They work it all into the language, and it's like you're absorbing it through osmosis because you don't realize you're being told these things. Mm-hmm. That is not info dumping. So, but it's strange. Like, we have terms that we use, and we think that they're absolutely fine, and everyone uses the same term the same way, and then clearly we don't.
I mean, that's a great point, because I'm sure there's terms that I'm saying that I don't mean to. Like, I can't think of anything off the top of my head, but I'm sure I do it too.
Well, no, I mean, this wasn't an attempt at, oh, what you say. No, it's not that. Because even when we think about how we're trying to express something about a book, so let's say we describe the prose as being self-indulgent, right? So what is meant by self-indulgent? Because if you think about it, that means that this is all unnecessary. This whole section, this prose that we're talking about, it's self-indulgent. So it's unnecessary, it's overblown, it's overwritten, it should be excised. That's what self-indulgent means. And you go, right, is that what you mean by self-indulgent? Because quite often that's not what people mean. They mean, it could be that they mean it is discursive, it is digressive, it is not economical, and they're using self-indulgent as a way to do that. But self-indulgent is highly pejorative. So instead of describing it as discursive, because it is discussing something, or even digressive, which tiny little bit of pejorative in there because it's saying it's moving away from the main, but those things are far less pejorative than self-indulgent, which is an outright criticism of the author, the editor of the novel, and the novel itself. And that's kind of what I'm getting at here. Is you always seem to come across as being very careful and very good about the language that you use, because when you make a statement about a book, like we said, you qualify it, you explain why, and that always gives context to your point. But I think sometimes when we talk about books, we fall into that informal register that we have when we talk with friends, where we say something and they then can ask us about it and we would qualify. But when we're doing it in a review, there isn't that immediate feedback for us to give the qualification. And therefore it stands as a statement without needing justification or qualification. Does that kind of make sense?
Oh yeah, and I think it's probably partially ingrained in me to not do that, because then you get the influx of just terrible screaming commenters, and then you can't even try to have a conversation about it because then you've upset someone so much. And I do think that I try so hard to avoid maybe terminology like that, or even just those like definitive statements. Like I don't even tend to make just a direct statement about it. I sometimes I'm like, well, it would have been better. I mean, I just recently did this. I have a video going up next week about all the things I don't like about the Wheel of Time. And I'm like, I'm not ready for it.
If you need emotional support, don't be afraid to call. You're going to criticize the Wheel of Time now with the trailer and everything?
Yeah, it's not my favorite series. So, but in saying that, I'm like, yeah, I didn't like these things, and the books would have been better, in my opinion, if this was done differently. But that's not the story Robert Jordan wanted to tell, and that's not what he was trying to do. Who the heck am I to say he should have wrote this book this way? I'm not the author. I did not know his intent for the story, the characters. This is just how I'm interpreting his words. And that's something that I really dislike as a reviewer watching other reviews, is when somebody says, like, definitively, it would have been better without these certain things. Like, I mean, to you, yes, but you can't just make a blanket statement saying that, like, this book would have been better, because ask 150 different people, you're going to get so many different answers.
You'll quite likely get 250 answers, because some people go, well, it's both this and this.
Yeah.
But that's like a brilliant point. And it's something that I firmly believe as well, because what I like about a book, and this is something I run into when I'm editing. When you're editing for someone, you don't edit their book to make it the book that you want, because it's not about what you want. Yeah. When you're editing a book, you're trying to make it trying to help the author achieve the best possible vision of their story that you can. And this is something I feel quite passionately about, because what is good for one person will be absolutely miserable for another person. And to say this book would have been better if this had happened, or that wasn't in it, or they had changed that thing, that's making a statement about the text would have been better if that had happened. And you go, to me, that sounds much more like, I would have enjoyed this text more if that thing hadn't been in it. And you go, that is very much a personal preference. That is a personal opinion that you have every right to have. And I would defend your right to have it, just as I would equally criticize you for saying, this book would have been better if that thing hadn't been in it. Because then you're making a declarative statement. And unless you have really good evidence for that argument, unless your evidence is spot on, I would be more critical of that approach. Because certainly, you have a video coming up about the Wheel of Time. This video will obviously take me a while to edit because I'm useless at video editing. I'm really good at text editing. But in the Wheel of Time, one of the issues that I had with Eye of the World was the heavy Tolkien influence. So much of Eye of the World was so heavily influenced by Tolkien that it was as if, in part, Jordan had taken Tolkien and painted over the top of it and gave it some superficial changes. Now, that is not to say that he just copied Tolkien. But that was a problem I had with it because I knew Tolkien's work so well and I loved Tolkien's work so much that seeing this, it felt too like Tolkien, and I was predicting a lot of things, and I found it then boring and tedious. And the variations that were built in Eye of the World were not significant enough for me to really enjoy. Now, obviously over the course of the series, it develops significantly beyond that. But for me, that was a problem. For someone else who was craving something that was very like Tolkien, but different enough, The Eye of the World would have been the perfect book because it had enough similarities to Tolkien that it had that sense of familiarity, but it was different enough in a lot of the little details that it felt new, it felt fresh. So I wouldn't say Jordan's book would have been better if he'd never read Tolkien or if he'd changed all of the Tolkienian elements. But I would say for me as a reader, I would have preferred something that wasn't quite so reliant on Tolkien. And I think there is a distinction between those two positions.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's, I think I'm somebody who's very comfortable and very understanding that we all have different preferences. Maybe this is because I feel like I have very eclectic tastes. I always have to defend myself all the time with things. And so like, the thing I always relate it back to is like my favorite music genre is metal. I like to listen to metal, okay? And that's one music genre that you ask a ton of people, I'll listen to anything but metal, right? So if I put metal music in your headphones and you're somebody who doesn't like it, you hate it, like it's gonna be a bad time for you. That doesn't make the music bad. So I try to say that like sometimes, for example, in one of the Wheel of Time books, there's a nearly 200-page chapter of battle and action. And I don't like reading battle and action for the most part. And people are like, well, that's just wrong. I'm like, it can't be wrong. I just don't prefer those portions of a novel the most in comparison to other parts of the novel.
But what's weird is people say this about books all the time, but very rarely are films defended in the same way, or the argument made about films in the same way. So for instance, a film like John Wick, which is heavily action-based, and the fight choreography in it is exquisite fight choreography. It's really well done. Mm-hmm. And you go, yeah, but I'm not a big fan of long fight scenes, so a lot of John Wick fell flat for me because that's not the thing that I enjoy. Oh, but you have to enjoy it because it's really well done. And you go, no, I know it's really well done. Like it looks seamless. Look, it's exquisitely choreographed. Look at how that tied into that. You can appreciate the technique. But I'm going, my heart's not pumping. I'm not sitting here going, oh yeah, because that's not what I'm invested in. At the same time, my mother used to watch a style of film that she would call a weepy, one that made you cry. And it was one of those emotionally overwrought melodramas that was punching you right in the iconic feels every single time. And it was always about some beautiful young girl whose life ends in tragedy and then everyone dies of cancer or something. And like everyone's bawling their eyes out at the end. My mum adored that type of film. You would have to tie me to a seat to watch that kind of film. But I would never say that those films were crap. My mum loved them, and they can be exceptionally well crafted, and they can be exceptionally well done. And you know, I wouldn't then say that you have to have X or Y to make it a good film. It's we have personal taste. There's nothing wrong with having a personal taste or preference, and you can't force that on anyone else.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a bizarre concept to me that people don't all agree on that. You know?
Getting two people to agree on anything is difficult. But one, I will say one thing though is, when people, one of the criticisms I've heard of the Malazan books, and if you look on Goodreads or on the Reddit, now admittedly, there are a lot of people who take time and thought and effort into how they review on Goodreads. And there are people who take time and effort and thought and how they post questions on Reddit. If you think of the bit of the statement I'm not saying, is that there's another side to that. People who don't necessarily take the same time, effort, and thought. And one of the things that caught my eye the other day was someone had said about Gardens of the Moon, it's badly written. The prose is bad. Actually, they said the prose are bad, which bugs me because it's a singular plural. The prose are bad. So they meant to say the prose is bad. It's badly written. The prose is bad. The characters suck. And the plot doesn't make any sense. I literally have hours of videos pointing out how well written that particular book is, how all of the elements of the plot are tied thematically and symbolically to each other, that they are exquisitely mirrored. Like, this is one of the most heavily structured novels in terms of matching symbols and imagery and theme and plot across the entire novel. It is intricately constructed, and the level of language that Erikson employs, he employs some beautiful poetic language and devices in his writing. Now, does that mean that that style of writing is going to be entertaining or engaging for everyone? No, but it's not badly written. It's really well written. It mightn't be your taste, it mightn't be your style, but that's not the same as it being bad.
Yeah, I don't know if people don't understand how to make that distinction. I did not enjoy the characterization, or I did not enjoy the writing style versus this is bad. Like, I don't know if that just people don't hear the difference maybe, but it's definitely very common. I try to stay off of most social media, to be honest, especially when it comes to anywhere that my videos might be posted on, like Reddit or something.
Well, it was only this year, really, because I remember it was probably about like 10 years ago or something. I'd looked, someone, I think it was probably Steve's son, had told me, go and look at this thing on Reddit. And I clicked on a link and go, what's Reddit? And had to create an account and everything. But then because of launching a kind of YouTube channel talking about stuff, I thought, oh, I'll engage with what the fans are saying. I'll be a man of the people. Oh God, that was a mistake. But I thought because I don't go on these things, not because they're not any good, but it's just not the thing that I focused on. And so I was trying to find out about it, and I was reading this, and you could see the vein in my temple starting to throb. And again, there are some exquisitely written responses, beautiful, thoughtful, intelligent commentary. I am not saying that you cannot have those things, and people don't do those things. And it's the same thing I say about my people who comment on my videos. A lot of them are incredibly well read, and they are incredibly intelligent. And other people who come to the channel might have all of the intelligence in the world, but they're not as aware of, say, literary knowledge and background and criticism in the way that I am. And you go, but that doesn't make them stupid, that doesn't make them dumb, and it doesn't make their opinion worth less. But that's what the YouTube community of talking about books does for me, is it helps us all communicate and add to each other's experience. Mm-hmm. And the thing that I find disheartening about it is when people use very pejorative language, which from the context of what they're saying, they don't actually intend. And they end up saying things that I think that they don't actually mean. Or in order, because you're on YouTube and you're trying to beat the algorithm, and you're trying to promote these things because you're passionate about your channel and you're passionate about your views and you're passionate about the books that you want to talk about. But putting in things as clickbait to try and drive traffic, which necessitates also, changing the style of your review, changing how you refer to things. And ultimately, I think that can be distracting from the purpose that you initially intended, which was to talk about the things that you love.
Yeah, and I feel like I really, when I first started watching booktube, I think those things kind of stick out to me, and I try to stay away from them because it does not feel genuine to me, and I feel like you can sort of tell when things are an attention grab. And I'm not like criticizing anybody for their choices, but you can sort of feel if the booktuber, reviewer, whoever they are, is genuine about their feelings about a book versus if they're doing something for views or attention, I suppose. And I think that because when I started, I mean, when we all started our channels, right? We're making videos for like 2 subscribers at the beginning, right? So we're like, who cares? I'm just going to sit down and say my feelings because it's a way for me to talk to somebody about the things I love. So I never had the goals of like, I'm going to have this many subscribers by this time, or I have to try to do the catchiest thumbnails or this and that. I just kind of like tried to do what feels natural, I suppose. So as not to stick out like, and I'm not trying to be like, I'm not trying to be insulting, but I sort of like know what you mean.
Well, if I could create like a really clickbaity thing, maybe I try it once, but that's not going to keep people coming back to the channel, because that I couldn't sustain that. I couldn't sustain that level of thing because it's not what I do. It's not what I'm interested in. And I think those YouTubers that we follow, that we subscribe to, and that we watch on a regular basis are usually the ones that are supplying a genuine level of content that we enjoy, that we appreciate, that there's an element to it that's what we want. And that generally is the ones who are being honest about what they are doing and what they're trying to do, and they have, this is how I do things, and we click with their style, and we go, yeah, that's what I want to watch. That's genuine entertainment or genuine education, and I'm interested in that. Certainly I wasn't expecting, like, I have a small YouTube channel, and I was expecting after about a year to have about 500 subscribers. That was my goal. Starting in January, I went, I will have 500 subscribers by the end of the year, even if I have to go out and pay people. And I now have over 2,500 subscribers, and I'm just like, did you all fall on your head? I'm not that interesting. And it's a genuine honor and a pleasure. And what I love about this is the level of outreach it gives me is so much more than I ever had when I was teaching at a university. Because there, when you're teaching a room of 15 or 35 or 60 students, think of that as 60 students. Let's say you have 3 contact hours a week. That's 180 hours. When we're done with our talk, Brittany, have a look at the number of hours viewed that your channel has. And if you think a lecturer with 60 students, that class is 180 hours a week, and you look at your weekly viewing numbers, and that gives you the level of impact that you have, that many people, that number of contact hours, that you can reach out and influence people, educate people, get them excited about things. And that's the power of this whole thing. And I absolutely love it. So yeah, I do quite boring videos about narrative. But it's the thing that I'm interested in. It's my thing. And if other people want to watch it, that's brilliant. But
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
oh, no, please.
I was gonna say that's like the really cool thing about, I mean, all the aspects, everyone having their own little spot in the booktube world, and evaluating like all the different reasons why one might read to begin with, and how like those things play a role in the way that you talk about and review books. So like, I mean, I think that's amazing, the opportunity you have to like educate and discuss the topics you're passionate about. Whereas for me, um, I have been through a very, very rough lots of years of my life. And so for me, reading is like therapy. Like I feel like reading and going through certain processes with characters is more effective for my mental health than I mean, I've gone 2 years of therapy and counseling as well. So, but at this point in my life, like maintaining it is helpful in me processing my emotions. Like, so it's not even just a level of me reading for enjoyment. It is a level of like me working through and processing my emotions. So the books that I tend to love help me do that in some way. So I guess that's kind of not the angle, because that makes it sound like I have this objective plan, but that's how I try to relate to people. So even like when it's hard, when you get bad feedback, it's the messages of people saying, hey, this helped me through whatever time, because you being open about your experiences through this book. I mean, we're talking about books, is actually helping somebody in their life. And I think that's kind of why my reviewing experience is a little bit different, only because I don't have all of the technical knowledge that I wish I did, but it's more of like an emotional response and relatability factor, I suppose.
And but you know, this takes us into this whole discussion about why do we read? And
Mm-hmm.
we all read different books for different reasons. Like you just beautifully articulated, you know, reading as an emotional response to process catharsis and to process emotion and to uh, work through issues. And
Mm-hmm.
I've done that. I think a lot of people have done that. That reading can help us improve our empathy because we start imagining things from different perspectives not our own. Sometimes we read one of those pick up, read, and forget books, which is bubblegum for the brain, that it's highly entertaining. You love every minute of it. You fly through it, and then you go, done, never look at it again. And in about 5 days, someone said, what was that book like? Oh, it was great. What happened in it? No idea. Because it was one of those ones, it was a fun experience at the time, but it didn't stay with you. But that same book, because of what happened in it, might have an entirely different resonance for someone else, because there could be an event in that book that deeply connects to their lived experience. So that's one of the things that I absolutely love about literature. Its
Mm-hmm.
malleability and its ability to speak to us in different ways at different times of our life. Because I know books that I read when I was younger, and I was identifying with certain characters in them and working through their problems. And now when I read those books, I'm identifying with the much older figures in that book who want to slap the protagonist around the head and go, would you ever grow up? That I've aged. And the book hasn't. The book has remained the same. That
Yeah.
protagonist that I used to more closely identify with because they were the young hero going on a quest. I know I go, oh God, that used to be me and I was such an idiot. And then my wife would look at me and say, no, but you're still an idiot, AP. You haven't grown up.
Yeah.
So I love that about books. And it's something I really admire is you being so open and honest and connected to that experience. Because it is difficult to share that. It gives you a level of vulnerability. And
Yeah, it does. And sometimes I like borderline, I'm like, do I share too much? But then like I know, okay, if I've been through these things and I can literally help anybody feel less alone, then it's worth it. Cause like I'm good. You know what I mean? I'm not in these dark spaces anymore. But it's people who don't necessarily read a lot or know that I read a lot of sci-fi and fantasy, and they're like, that's so dumb. And I'm like, okay, but it's not the case. I mean, a book that I read gave me the courage to leave an abusive marriage. The Malazan Book of the Fallen, why you should read video I made that I wanted to make sure Steven Erickson saw, where countless people, like one person said it saved their life. Like they're living on this earth still because of that book series. Like that's tremendous. And there's no way that it's just one person. You know, like that's just one series, for example, because I get a lot of, well, you don't like military fantasy. Why are you reading the last Book of the Fallen? Because I don't know, first of all, but the emotional impact. And in that series specifically, because I concluded it this year, the amount of people's lives that it impacted the way they think and they act in their every day-to-day life is, I mean, that's just incredible to me. And that's why books are powerful to me. And that's what I'm looking for in things that stand out as my favorites. I'll still read a good book that's a popcorn, type of book. But when it comes to like me being able to speak about and review things that leave that emotional impact, I suppose.
Yeah, and the strange thing is, you can read a book at a certain point and go, oh, it was good. It was an entertaining read. Something can happen in your life and you just stumble across it, you reread it, and suddenly that book, you go, oh my God, this is amazing. This is really speaking to me. Mm-hmm. And you go, and again, I come back to that point that the text hasn't changed. The text never changes unless you get the author's preferred edition launched, 10 years after it was initially published. But the text doesn't change. We change. And when we change, our interpretation of the narrative changes. The narrative actually changes because it's what we are assigning importance in our brain. We are imagining it. And people do lots of different things for entertainment. People have lots of different hobbies for different reasons. And it could be entertainment. It could be escapist. It could be to feel emotion. It could be to channel emotion. It could be for intellectual engagement. All of these, any combination of them, but at different points in your life as well. It could be different things, and different books do different things at different points in your life. And I think that is something about the reading experience that I love. It's something that is one of the things that drew me back into university to study narrative, because how could I read a book like The Lord of the Rings and go, this book is brilliant, and one of my friends read The Lord of the Rings and go, this book is shit? You go, how can that be? Someone needs to explain to me how that can be. And I wanted to find out why. I wanted to understand why. And I know that your emotional response to a book is very unlikely to change with additional information because it is your emotional response. But I have a fun story that's kind of embarrassing about me and Joe Abercrombie, if you'd like to hear it. Mm-hmm. A number of years ago, when the book, was it the Warriors, the standalone, the Heroes, and I happened to be at a thing where Joe Abercrombie was going to be doing a reading, and a mutual friend had introduced us, and I was sitting chatting to Joe Abercrombie, and I had only just read the Heroes, and being the social idiot that I am, I was like, well, you know what, I loved the First Law trilogy. Absolutely loved the First Law trilogy. Oh, so what do you think of the Heroes? I loved the First Law trilogy. And, Joe Abercrombie is not a stupid person. He worked out my code that I hadn't enjoyed the Heroes. And we were talking about it. And I was trying to explain, it didn't work for me. And he went, oh, well, unfortunately, I'm doing a reading from that tonight. You might as well not come. And he was incredibly gracious about it. He was incredibly nice about it. But that evening, he was giving a reading from the book. So I went in to listen to his reading. And he was about 45 seconds into the reading. And I went, I have completely misread this novel. Because he was implying a comedic tone to one of the characters. The character was meant to be read as exaggerated and over the top and a figure of fun. And I'd read the character straight as arrogant and pompous and hateful. I had completely misread it. And this was actually, the author intent was, this character was meant to be funny. You were meant to be laughing at this character. And I'd had an emotional, visceral reaction to this character of, I want to stab him in the face, and this isn't enjoyable, and I really hate this. And suddenly, thinking back through the narrative, at that point, I went, actually, yeah, I really like this book now. Because I could reorder and recontextualize the novel in my head. And I went, actually, yeah, that now makes it, oh, this is a much better book than I thought. And that's kind of what I try to do with a lot of the stuff on my channel. Is I am not saying to someone that their experience of a novel is wrong or incorrect. I try to explain the stuff that I see in it and how I see these points of connections. And sometimes that allows people to go, oh, I hadn't thought about it from that point of view. That changes things. I might reread it and come to a different perspective. But I don't force anyone to do that, and I don't say that their experience is invalid. And I owe Joe Abercrombie a huge apology.
It's funny that you say that, because The Heroes is probably my favorite of his books. I've read all of his books, and it's probably my favorite one, which is interesting since I don't like war in action scenes, and that's my favorite.
But even then, like, someone can say, I don't like, I'm a big fan of epic fantasy. That is, it's the genre I spent so much time studying. It's a genre that I love. Does that mean I like every epic fantasy book? No, increasingly there are a lot of epic fantasies I don't enjoy, but it's still kind of my favorite genre. Does that mean, and I go, well, I'm not particularly fond of time travel narratives. And part of it is I spent an entire semester studying time travel in science fiction. And I read a lot of time travel stories and the different types of time travel stories. So now when I read time travel, I'm like, I've seen that done. And you can almost predict where it's going because you can see the beats that they are using and what they're drawing from. But that doesn't mean that the next time travel story that comes along isn't going to be one that's going to blow my socks off. It's just on the balance of probabilities, it's less likely to. And I think that's an important distinction.
Yeah, and that kind of goes along with what you were saying earlier before we started this video. With what I try to say is that there's like seasons in your life for everything, and I think that includes reading for me. So like I've read so much fantasy that now I still enjoy fantasy, but I'm kind of reaching more towards like speculative fiction or magical realism, just like a couple different subgenres that I want to read more of. And so if for me, like being somewhat of a mood reader, like I will flat out say, I wasn't in the mood to read this book, and maybe I'd freaking love it had I waited until I wanted to pick this book up. And I try to be honest about that, because there's no doubt that there are circumstances in your life, whether it is your mood based on life events, your mood for what you're in the taste to read, just anything can affect the way that you enjoy a book while you're reading it and what you pick up on and what impacts you, I think. So to act like those aren't factors as a reader is silly because they play a role in the experience.
Yeah, and I think this is one of the big differences between reading for pleasure, like reading for fun, reading for pleasure, and reading academically or professionally as an editor or as an academic or doing these sorts of things. Is we have to teach books that we don't like, but we have to be enthusiastic about it. As an editor, sometimes you have to edit a novel of a style or a choice that you don't like. So you set aside your personal likes and dislikes, and you start focusing on the techniques, what the author is trying to do, looking at causal links and narrative structures. And ultimately, yeah, obviously your personality is going to play into it. Obviously your preferences will influence you at a certain point. Your mood is going to influence you. It can't help doing that because, you know, we're human, we're not automatons. But you learn to kind of step outside of it to a greater or lesser extent because you have to professionally. Like standing up in front of a crowd of students, you can't go, right, we have to read Charles Dickens' Bleak House. Look, I know, like, it's shit and it's crap and you're gonna hate it, and right, just struggle through it. Well, like, think of it as the old Dunkirk spirit. We'll all rally round together with this shit book and we'll just fight our way through to the very end. We'll have to do it because there's an exam. Can you imagine trying to teach a class like that? But and that's with Bleak House, which is, you know, canonically great English literature, and yet You know, do I like Bleak House personally? It's not my go-to read. But are there aspects about the writing that I think are really interesting, that are really engaging? Yeah. So if I did a video on Bleak House on my channel, I'm going to talk about all of those things that I think are interesting about it or that are engaging about it, because those are the things that fascinate me. But if I preface that video with, I really hate this book, it's a slightly tonally dissonant video there.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. That I think is just kind of showing one of the major differences in review style, being able to detach yourself to some degree. And I think I can to some extent. Like I just read Neuromancer for the first time, and that was like one of my first experiences reading cyberpunk. And like I enjoyed it, but I didn't have the most fabulous time because it was my first time dipping my toes in that. I don't want to say like genre as a whole, but I felt lost a lot. And so I can sort of like separate my feelings from what was actually written, and I can appreciate like, you know, why other people liked it or why it was an impactful novel. So I think I can to some degree, but that's a skill I don't completely have, like taking emotion out of it.
Well, but the thing is, you can never completely divorce yourself of it. That's well. Let me rephrase. I can never completely do it. Maybe there are some people who can, that have exercised this skill, but I've seen this in a professional sense. A lawyer, lawyers who passionately defend their client in court, and you know, when they're back in the privacy of their own office, they go, "Do not touch me." They don't like their client, but they separate themselves. The work is the work,
Yeah.
and the personal is the personal. There is a clear separation, and it's why I think some people actually struggled a lot during lockdown, or when they were working from home, because it used to be when you left your job, you had that commute home. And in the commute home, that's when you slowly got out of work mode. And then you came home and you got changed into more comfortable clothing and you're like, home.
Yeah.
But when you were working from home, you're like, right, I'm in work mode and I'm home and I'm still in work mode and I'm still home. And I finished work or have, well, I'll just check that email. And there was no psychological separation anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So people have different techniques for it. And I think it's quite interesting, because the one last thing, if do you still have time?
Yeah.
Yep. The one last thing I thought we could talk about is reader expectation, because this is something as something of a newbie to most social media and YouTube and Twitter. I I am not overly familiar with a lot of this, but this was the first time I'd really experienced hype for something. Um, this is something that usually passes me by completely. That I would find out, oh, the Wheel of Time TV show's coming out. I must look for that when it comes out. And the deluge of tweets about the Wheel of Time, the reaction videos to the Wheel of Time teaser trailer, the reaction to the reaction videos, the trailer breakdown, the reaction to the trailer breakdown, the commentary on the trailer breakdown, reaction breakdown trailer. And I'm sitting there going, I can't, it was too much. It was overload. I went, just mute everything to do with the Wheel of Time. Mute. Can I mute? Because it was too much for me. And this was the first time I'd ever experienced this. And it was like a light bulb going off in my head, because I'd always heard people refer to stuff like this before. But I honestly had no idea what it was like. And I've just seen Wheel of Time trailer stuff and I've just gone, oh, right, okay. But it's this whole thing about expectations and hype and perception of a novel or a narrative before you read it, which I think is really interesting in how it can alter our experience of encountering the narrative. And I wanted your thoughts on that.
Yeah. First of all, I haven't watched any of those Wheel of Time videos either because I just like I don't like knowing too much before I like experience it for myself. So I just want to like, watch it. And
Exactly.
actually, this happens. I don't know if you heard of the Netflix Shadow and Bone series. That's the
I
adaptation of young adult books. When that came out, I was like, I am not watching that because like everybody can't stop talking about it. Just like get it away from me. And then I ended up watching it later, and I was like, that's pretty good. But
well, let me confess, I've never read the books, but I did see there were a whole flurry of videos about this, and I went, "Oh, that's a fantasy show I know nothing about. I'll watch it."
yeah,
And I watched it. I did a very short video about an aspect of it that lost me. That there was a narrative direction that suddenly gets added to it, and I went, that wasn't actually signaled, and it ruined that. But let's just say that that particular TV show, not aimed at me, but Ben Barnes is lovely.
yeah, right. I'm gonna go watch that video after this, and I'll comment. You know, I feel like I made some kind of video because I feel like I remember either saying like reader responsibility or it's not the book's fault or something like that in a video one time. But I think that I was speaking with my friend Joanna about this actually, and there's one of the things I hate the most when people say, and I used to say, I have said it, you will find videos where I have said this, okay? It wasn't what I expected, so I didn't really like it. Like the book wasn't what I was expecting, so I gave it like 2 stars because it just wasn't what I wanted. Well, they didn't write the book for what you wanted. So is that the book's fault? Don't think so. So that's why like then I got into this whole phase where I'm like, I'm going to make sure it's an interesting concept. I'm not going to read too much into the synopsis because then I'm going to think that the book is one thing. Or the worst thing is these comp titles. Every book comes with like a couple comp titles, and it's the next Game of Thrones, it's the next Mandalorian, it's the next Cowboy Bebop, it's, you know what I mean? And then if you love one of those things, you're like, oh my God, like it's going to be great. And obviously the author was not trying to recreate Cowboy Bebop, right? But it's like, it was just an influence. Or so when there is too much hype or you read too much into the synopsis that you think you know what the book is going to be, I think that almost sets you up for failure sometimes, because I mean, how could it be exactly what you want it to be if you've not read it? Like, you know what I'm saying? So I go through phases where if something's like really super popular and talked about over the top all the time, I just tend to like stay away from it, because I know that if I think that I have like the highest expectations or start buying into the hype, I'm less likely to love it as much as I would if I like gave it some time in between, if that makes sense.
I mean, perfectly. And okay, another slightly embarrassing confession here. You know those blurbs that sometimes go on books where they've quoted a review or something like that, and it is the next Game of Thrones or things like that. I may have written a few of those for various books.
Yeah.
For various books. And I will stand behind all of the ones that I ever used. But it was when I was writing reviews of a certain type for a certain thing, and it always included, usually at the very start or at the very end, one of those short snippet quotable things that would be easy for someone to lift out to put on a book cover, because it then advertised the publication that you'd written for.
You know what? In as like a marketing advertising aspect, like I would do the same thing. It's great marketing, because then you know that for fans of this certain thing, hey, you might like this. That's smart. I just mean there are some people that when they read that, they're not able to separate, like it's not going to be the same thing. So you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do apologize. I am one of the people that has done that. But
don't apologize.
But I will stand behind the ones that I did. But in saying that, we saw this with other fantasy adaptations trying to be the next Game of Thrones. And while Game of Thrones was in its like second season, there were a couple of different fantasy shows that kind of were airing and never really caught on. And I think part of it was sometimes when people say it's like a Game of Thrones, they're not saying what aspects of Game of Thrones it's like. And if they mean it has sex and violence, you're like, that's not really the draw of why Game of Thrones was compelling. because it was the flawed, interesting, and engrossing characters. It was the dialogue. It was the balance of the action sequences versus character introspection and character development. All of that tied into Game of Thrones. When you go, we want the Game of Thrones, this just put some sex and violence in it. You go, you've misidentified the good things,
Yeah.
and reduced it down to something very, very simplistic.
Yeah.
But reader experience and reader expectation. I totally agree with you about like those trailers that give you too much. I hate watching Hollywood trailers now because for certain films, particularly comedies, you know when you watch a trailer for a comedy movie and you go, that's all of the best jokes from the film.
Yeah. Yeah.
I am now going to go and watch this film, and I bet all of the best jokes were actually in that trailer. And 70-80% of the time you're right. Trailers seem to become more and more explicit now because this is exactly what the film is going to be. We don't want to mislead the audience. So here is a tiny snippet version of the film. But trailers used to be things to whet your appetite in anticipation, and the film was still going to be a surprise. And now I personally, I feel that a lot of trailers give too much away. So I don't watch trailers, which is why I miss out on the hype train. Yeah. I learned a new term.
I think that can be a good thing to do that, because also I tend to not watch even spoiler-free reviews most of the time until I've read the book, because I don't want any outside influence on how I feel. And I know myself good enough to know that if I hear somebody say a negative, even if it's just a tiny little detail, it's going to stand out to me when I'm reading it. And that little thought wouldn't have been in my mind if I hadn't watched it. And then I can't make my own opinion solely based on my thoughts, because now it's influenced at this point by an outside source.
And it's a bit like, obviously, we've both read The Wheel of Time. But imagine you'd never read The Wheel of Time, and I went, well, Jordan's fixation on people tugging their braids and heaving their breasts or crossing their arms under their breasts. Yeah. Now that is in your head, if you started reading it, every time that came up, you'd go, oh yeah, the AP was exactly right. It's happened again. But if you count it up, and someone must have done a search of the entirety of The Wheel of Time to count up the number of references to braid tugging, and actually totaled it for the entirety of The Wheel of Time, put it next to the word count, and you go, is that a lot? The perception of it might be a lot, but that's because how often does does toast land butter side down? And we all have this, it always lands butter side down. And it doesn't. 50% of the time it lands butter side up. It's a 50-50 chance. Yeah. But we always remember, if it happens, you go, it always lands butter side down. Whereas if it lands butter side up, you don't remember that.
Yeah.
And that's a really weird thing about, it's the double-edged sword, I think, of anticipation and trying to find out about something. And again, marketers are trying to increase interest and awareness of a story or a film or a book, and they want people excited. But it kind of goes into overload where it gets overanalyzed, and it turns into this whole thing where then when the eventual product comes out, it's never going to live up to that experience. Yeah. Because you've had weeks or months of continually building it up again and again and again and going over every single detail, that by the time it comes out, you're almost exhausted.
And I think that's really relatable to anything. I did this when I was planning a vacation to Greece. And it's not that I didn't think it was absolutely fabulous and loved it, but I had researched everything so thoroughly, looked at every single picture, because I'm planning this trip, first time leaving the country, want to make sure it's perfect. And then I got there and I'm like, well, I already saw this. I literally already saw every little detail of all of this. Why have I done this? So now I do the bare minimum research that I need to do when I'm vacationing, because I don't want to see everything and know everything before I get to actually experience it, because it spoils it.
Well, you see, don't ruin my imagination here, but I imagine you go, intern, come here, book me into a 5-star spa. That's what I'm imagining. That is my truth now. You're not allowed to disabuse me of that notion.
I am like a hiker. Put me in the wilderness. I will stay in a tent. It's fine. Not high maintenance.
I when we finish the stream, I will tell you a story.
Okay.
When we finish this video, I will tell you a story. It's not for public, this one, but but I think like we've had a brilliant chat here about all of these different things, and I know I've taken up a huge amount of your time. I really do appreciate it.
Yeah.
Is there anything else that you want to talk about, that you feel that this was a point I wanted to get to and we haven't gotten to it yet?
I think that I kind of just want to say that I really appreciate the different types of reviewers. And as I said, like I do tend to watch a lot of reviewers that aren't my style. I think I prefer a lot of like discussion type of videos and booktube in general. So like I said, I'm not watching a ton of reviews, but yeah, I just want it to be clear that like I don't think the way I review books is the best way to review books. I hope it doesn't come across that way. But I think it's very interesting what individuals bring to the reading and reviewing experience. And I love having discussions like this because it brings so many different things to like my attention, or maybe your attention, with different ways that people relate to books and talking about them with their audience, I suppose, if that makes sense.
And I think everyone, I mean, one of the things that I always want to encourage, and I always try to celebrate, is we all have a unique take on books, and that take is personal to us and it is valuable. And you said that you know, you're not necessarily saying that your review style is the best. I would humbly suggest, and feel free to disagree, that your review style is the best style of review for you. It fits what you want to do. And I think that is what I try to express when I talk about reader response theory and all of these different things, that it's not that there is a right way and a wrong way, but there are reactions to and consequences to what we say and what we do. And the more we know about it, I think the more specific sometimes we can be, or the more effective we can be as communicators. And the multiplicity of voices, the fact that we have people from different cultures, different parts of the world, different age groups, different ethnicities, different religious groups, different sexual orientation, different gender. We all have these unique experiences, and that adds to our understanding. Because I saw someone the other day had said they were thinking about making a Malazan video, and seeing all of these other Malazan videos, they didn't know what more they could add. And my response to that was your voice. Mm-hmm. You add your voice, you add your take. It doesn't matter if someone else has already said it. I have a video where I go Niflrog, Niflrog on YouTube, who's a brilliant Malazan expert, had done this video while mine was rendering or was scheduled to upload. He got it out before me. And I still released my video, even though Niflrog had covered a lot of in fact, I re-recorded it to put in a bit at the front because I didn't know how to edit a clip in. I re-recorded the entire thing to acknowledge Niflrog in the video because he had a brilliant video on it. But just because he'd said a lot of the same stuff, it was mostly the same, but it was from a different perspective, and it was my perspective. And I wanted to add, not take away or stake out my own personal claim. We all add to the discussion. We have a unique voice. So I love that about what you do.
And isn't that like the beautiful thing about taking a solo activity and allowing us to connect with other human beings? Because like through conversations and discussions about differences in opinions and perspectives, it really sort of connects us and goes back to having compassion and empathy for one another, trying to see something through another human being's eyes and what they've walked through in their experiences through literature. So yeah. I think
so, and that is an absolutely perfect way to finish. Thank you so much, Brittany. Thank you for coming on. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
And for all of you that are watching, thank you very much for watching, and we will see you in the next one.